Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, let's start. Welcome to the Radical Anthropology Group. And this evening we have Jerome Lewis, who has been a mainstay of the Radical Anthropology Group for decades. His topic this evening is how hunter-gatherers ensure proper sharing. Woman's biggest husband is the moon.
Okay, well, I'll take that as my kickoff. Is that right, Chris?
Exactly.
Okay. All right, well, greetings, everyone. So the title comes from a comment that's often made when a woman's menstruating by men talking about it, because actually hunter-gatherers have to keep careful check on who's menstruating and who isn't, because depending on who's menstruating in your hut, or if someone's menstruating in your hut, it will quite significantly change what activities you can safely undertake. And actually it unfolds into a whole series of taboos and prohibitions that really are at the heart of the gendered division of labor. And at some level, if we don't take the gendered division of labor to be some sort of hierarchical status claimed by one gender over the other, we can see it as a sort of sharing of roles, and a sharing which, in the way that Nurit was talking, is not about any sort of strict division of substance, of stuff, but is really about sharing place, sharing space, sharing activity, as much as it is about sharing out. And it's the contrast she draws between sharing in and sharing out. And both these types of sharing are really important in these societies. But understanding how and why, or how people learn this sharing and why they do it, is something that I want to talk about tonight. So we're talking about I'm talking about egalitarian societies. There are no leaders, there's no hierarchy, no status positions. They don't have familiar structures like schools or formal institutions which can judge or give authoritative evaluations of innovation or standardized knowledge in the way that we might be used to. And because they lack these sorts of institutions, some anthropologists have said that they're just simply random accumulations of cultural elements, and that it's a sort of an egalitarianism by accident. There's no stable set of values or practices that they pass down the generations. It's a sort of an accident of fate. I'm going to return to this point because, of course, I think it's deeply flawed. But first, I just want to reflect a little bit on the context, this context we call egalitarianism in British social anthropology. And we had a lovely talk. Any of you who are interested, do look at Nurit's talk from last week, because I think it offers a very rich reflection on the language we use to try and describe these very interesting societies. So core to these egalitarian outcomes, and this is different. We claim in Britain, for instance, to be an egalitarian society, but actually what we're claiming is to be a meritocracy, is a correct expression. So people are supposed to have an equality of opportunity, and then their individual merit results in differential outcomes. Some are successful, some aren't successful. Of course, it's inculcated from school with exams and competitions between members of the class and so on. But what these egalitarian societies do is they ensure an equality of outcomes. And the prime mechanism by which they do this is demand sharing. And anyone who doesn't have something they need, if they see somebody else who has more than they can immediately consume, they have an absolute right in these societies to demand it from that person. And that person has no right to refuse them. If they do, and of course people are always breaking rules, and they do, then the other person is quite justified to get angry or otherwise upset with that person and express that in various different ways. So in these societies, which are animistic, it's important to remember that persons come with many different sorts of skin. Some persons are human, some persons are animals, some are trees, some are spirits, and even in the Mbengele Bayaka conception, the forest is a very complex multi-organism, a person as well. And so demand sharing from their point of view can be legitimately used to get things from the forest, from animals, from spirits, and so on. It's not something that's just linked to humans. And that's, I think, why Nurit David's idea of a cosmic economy of sharing is so useful in this context. It's an economy of sharing which extends well beyond just the people that you have around you, that you can see about you. So tonight I'm going to share my understandings of how this cosmic economy of sharing is experienced, and crucially, how the system's learnt and shared between people through taboos that people are obliged to follow, and the puzzles that these practices set up for each generation of Bayaka as they go through their lives. And it's important, I think, to also recognize, and this is in response a bit to what Nurit David was telling us last week, or reminding us of last week, that an economy of sharing is familiar to all of us, of this demand sharing type, because it builds on models which are very current across the world among close kin, what we might characterize as the family, where in our families, it's very common for members to share with one another without the expectation of return, but just because someone asked and needs the thing, and that's been demanded. And so, like Nurit, Alan Barnard, for instance, used the idiom, a similar kinship idiom, to describe the quality of relations between Sun hunter-gatherers in southern Africa, and he calls this universal kinship, the extension of kin terms and kin behaviors potentially to anybody who is present. And this explains to some extent the ease with which outsiders are incorporated and included in sharing whenever they're present in a camp. And I think that this brings home a very subtle point that Nurit made last week, which is that kin relations in these societies are about crafting, about an activity of sharing, of demanding, of showing your care and concern to others. Excuse me. And so the crafting of kin relations through sharing space, activities, words, affection, and food and other necessities is very different to the sort of ascriptive kinship we think about, where it's a title, it's a status. I'm the father or mother or whatever, son or daughter. It's in these societies, it's a way of relating to others that the closest we can get to in our very hierarchical societies is the idiom of kinship. And it's really quite an achievement to have got to have been able to establish a society where demand sharing is the economy. It is the way that goods shift and move around between people. It's, you know, when you think of the difficulties we have in our current period to extract excess wealth from the hyper rich to support the very many very poor people in our societies, we start to perhaps get a sense of what an incredible achievement these hunter-gatherers have managed to do in their social systems. And James Woodburn, who was my supervisor, he called this immediate return egalitarian hunter-gatherers. And in fact, it's this egalitarianism, this overthrow of the alpha male and the tyranny of dominance and hierarchy that made possible the emergence of cooperation, of trust, and a normative order shared between people that enabled language, music, and culture to evolve. So this really is a very major achievement of humanity. And while it may sound simplistic, I just wanted to emphasize just how important it has been in the human story that there are communities who achieved this. So now I'll just introduce briefly the people that I've been working with all these years. They're sometimes called pygmy, and some groups resent that term, other groups find that term acceptable because for them it reflects various terms that they have for themselves, which try and which recognize the shared culture that they feel exists within what I now call a civilization across Central Africa of hunter-gatherers, forest people, and their numbers are quite high, between 350 and 900,000 hunter-gatherers. It's probably one of the largest groups of hunter-gatherers in the world, perhaps only the Australian Aborigines competing with them. Of that possibly 900,000 people, there may only be about 60 to 100,000 who are still living the forest hunter-gathering lifestyle. But that doesn't diminish the importance of that lifestyle for them. And all those other groups will emphasize that they are descendants of these first people, these forest hunter-gatherers. So although they speak different languages today, they have many shared cultural elements. And so perhaps if I talk about civilization next week, I'll go into that in more detail. But this evening, I just want to talk about their system of taboos that make a whole symbolic world come into being, where cultural differences between the genders become natural and inevitable, because they provoke each generation to figure out from the taboos, this system of prohibitions, the proper way for different things to be shared. And this extends from the meat of dead animals to appropriate laughter, semen, menstrual blood, and ends up, in fact, as a total system of forest management. And the taboo system, confusingly for an anthropologist like me, is just called by one name, ekila. And it's based on, at its heart, on the symbolic difference between the blood of women and creation and the blood of men killing animals, and the importance of keeping those two types of blood apart. And it's common to every group, pygmy group of forest hunter-gatherers that I've visited, that still are engaged in some elements of their forest lifestyle across Central Africa. That was very quick to say, but actually it took me years to figure it out. And actually that duration of figuring it out has become a key aspect of how I understand ekila today. And what I noticed as I started to come across in my notebooks of the first ekila practices, or things that people called ekila, my curiosity was tickled by these things. They were very striking and counterintuitive claims. For instance, a menstruating woman is ekila, okay? But a hunter's luck is his ekila. It's ekila for a pregnant woman to eat a blue daika, or she'll have a difficult childbirth. It's ekila to burn ticks on a fire. It makes people go mad. Or if my wife sleeps around, my ekila, i.e. as a man, my hunting, will be ruined. And if I sleep around, her ekila is ruined and she has a difficult time in childbirth, or may have a difficult time in childbirth. How is it that so many different things, from ticks burning on a fire to childbirth, are all connected together as ekila? And as I pondered and collected together all these different cases of ekila practices and taboos, I slowly started to see the connections. And once I realized some connections, they changed how I previously understood other linkages. And so I started to understand the importance of what Sandy Robertson's, who's an anthropologist, emphasis on the ontogenetic nature of cultural understanding and learning. So ontogeny is from biology. It's the word used to describe the developmental events that occur during the existence of a living organism. So for instance, in human beings, the transition from being a baby to being an infant, to being a toddler, to being a child, to being an adolescent, and so on. But among human beings, since culture plays such an important role, ontogeny extends beyond the biology of growth to include cultural practices and values. Another way of saying this is that culture is not learnt all at once, but rather different elements come to attention at different points in the life cycle. So culture is in bits and pieces, and the bits come and go through people's consciousness and transform in the process. And they return years later to be reconsidered and understood in a different way. My own experience of the word father is a good example. As a child, my understanding of what father meant was as a son and as a very small child. But as I grew into adolescence and became more rebellious, my understanding of father deepened and expanded. And then as I left home and became an independent adult, my understanding of father changed again. And then as I had my own children and became a father, the concept took on new meanings, took on new depths that I hadn't considered before. And of course, as I continued going through life, it continues to develop and evolve. So the point is that culture is ever changing. It's as one passes through life. It's never all held in the head of one person, but actually it's distributed in partial ways in many heads. A language is a classic example. I might be a native British English speaker, but I still need to use a dictionary because I don't know all the words of my own language. Neither do I know all the recipes that British people cook and treasure. So it's really important, I think, to understand cultural concepts as complex and multi-layered in how they combine with everyday life to enable people to experience different elements of core concepts in their culture. So once the ontogeny of culture is appreciated, it becomes, I think, much easier to understand the way that complex cultural concepts like ekila are passed down the generations. But this is a controversial point because in egalitarian contexts, how is knowledge transmitted when it's unacceptable to judge others or to use authority to insist on what the proper way of doing things is? Nobody in such societies can say, this is how you have to do things. People might comment and say, well, we did it like this before, but they won't ever directively instruct in the way that we're very used to in hierarchically organized societies. Neither can someone order or condemn others. And so this feeds into those debates I briefly raised at the very beginning about how these societies may be accidents. And Ron Brunton is the anthropologist that sort of most polemically and forcefully expressed this, that egalitarian societies are random assemblages. They're accidents of chance rather than intended or valued forms of political organization. And therefore they must be inherently unstable and short-lived. But as I've just described, the distribution of ekila across different groups speaking different languages and having been divided, separated for centuries and in some cases millennia, demonstrate that it is of great antiquity. So this poses a puzzle, how to understand such effective long-term continuity in these egalitarian contexts. Very similarly organized taboos that seek to keep menstrual blood away from the blood of hunting are shared by hunter-gatherers right across the world. And Alain Testard, French ethnographer, anthropologist actually, not an ethnographer, he demonstrated this 40 years ago in extraordinary comparative work he did on Australian Aborigines and other people, looking at the way that taboo structures were organized. But these same structures are common among San of Southern Africa, among the Batek of Malaysia, the Penan of Sarawak and Borneo, and as I just said, amongst indigenous Australians too. They are really ubiquitous. And the most common examples of these taboos focus on the way that menstruating women or menstrual blood neutralizes or makes ineffective arrow poisons or hunting success, or it leads to attack by dangerous animals. And these bloody connections, which are mediated by these taboos, use the striking symbolism of blood, of menstrual blood in particular, but also of animals' blood, or the moon, to link childbirth and hunting as the core gendered activities of people. They make the sexual division of labor seem natural by defining men and women as different but equal, as autonomous but interdependent, as in tension but cooperative. And these bloody taboos have been doing this for human groups for a very long time. But how? So I'm first going to briefly introduce Mbengele Bayaka. And don't get confused when I say Mbengele or Bayaka. It's the same people, and Mbengele is just the particular subgroup of Bayaka that I worked with. But all those forest hunter-gatherers in the Western Congo Basin are referred to as Bayaka, or contractions of that name. They live from wild foods. Men collect honey and hunt meat, particularly. Domestic animals are taboo for all adults. Women gather wild tubers, fish in marshes, and they collect fruit and vegetables and insects. Occasionally people do farm. They'll plant a banana tree or something, but they tend to be very small and poorly kept because people move too much. And there's this fundamental problem of relatives coming to demand share stuff off your farm, even if you're not there. And it can be very frustrating for those who've made the effort to establish the farm. People live in small, quickly built camps in the forest. It takes a couple of hours to sort of clear a little area and then collect the lianas and leaves to make the huts. They're groups between 10 and 60 people. 60 is quite rare, 10 to 30 is more common. They move regularly according to seasons and the availability of resources, but also equally just to visit friends and relatives and to avoid conflict. You know, their main way of solving a conflict is not to call a judge to argue and get everybody to sort it out, but just to avoid, to leave, to go. And often distance and time is a great healer, and people come back some years or months later and they get on just fine. And when I was in one of these camps, there was a farmer friend who came along and he said, look, you know, these two, the Bendjele, they're like two societies, one of men and one of women. And indeed, if you ever go into a Bendjele camp, in the middle of the camp, you generally have a sort of smoking table where meat that's been brought in is put to smoke. And around that, men will be sitting, talking to one another. And then the women will be in front of their hearths, in front of their little huts, which all face inwards towards the center. And during the day, men will tend to hang out together, and as will become clear why later. And women tend to go out in big groups with lots of children and making lots of noise, and spend most of their time in these gendered groups. And it's a very striking thing that you will witness if you spend time with them. So these societies are egalitarian. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to just refer to my PhD supervisor, James Woodburn's conceptualization of what he called immediate return societies. And what he meant by that was that these are societies that consume all the food that they produce on the day it's produced or shortly thereafter. He based this model on economics as a way in, but it extends to almost every aspect of their social organization. So rather than have long, convoluted justice procedures, well, if you're really furious, there are levels of fighting, and you can engage in physical combat with the person you're upset with, and they have ways to control so that it doesn't cause too much suffering or damage, but there are also levels which can be very dangerous. Or you just simply leave. You don't even bother saying that you're upset. You just go, and no one will ask you why or try and stop you. So very immediate ways of responding to things in general, not just in terms of economic practice. And indeed, this distinction that James Woodburn made between immediate return and delayed return is the most fundamental distinction between human societies right across the world. Apart from these very now rare hunter-gatherers, every other society in the world is a delayed return society. It's the most common social organization on the planet. Capitalism is a delayed return system. You invest in producing a product and selling it, or you invest in shares and your company does whatever it does and you get your money. Farming is the classic. You clear the land, you invest your labor in planting it, you wait, and over time, as the seasons change, you can start to go and harvest your crops. Pastoralism, of course, your herd, you tend it in order for it to grow so that you can, from time to time, take one of the animals for food. So all these forms of economic practice are delayed return forms. But it's important to remember that immediate return systems were far more common in the past, even in the very recent past, but certainly if one understands that 95% of Homo sapiens history was spent as hunter-gatherers, would have been even more diverse in that long history prior to the advent of pastoralism, farming, of course, indeed capitalism. So there is something very important about these societies and to understand them because of this ancient human tradition that they represent. And of course, they're modern people. I really reject any idea of primitivism in this. The notion of primitivism is really an ideological construction to justify colonialism, and it has no basis in any realistic understanding of the world. But that's another discussion we could have afterwards, if you like. So equality in these societies is achieved through direct individual access to resources. Nobody can stop you from going to get the things you need, because there's no sense of private property. There's no sense of objects being owned or otherwise controlled by others. Everyone has access to the means of coercion. So poisoned arrows, which are a really important tool of hunting, are basically available in every household. Anyone can take one. And you know, it doesn't matter if you're an old lady. If some man is really being abusive and horrible to you, in theory, you can wait till he falls asleep, you can take a poisoned arrow and you can just chuck him in the bottom. And this acts as a very powerful restraint on people's actions, because of course there are no police forces in these societies. There's nobody, you know, sorting out justice and telling people what to do. And mobility is crucial. The Benjele have no word for goodbye. When someone leaves, you normally don't say anything. It's considered rude. It gives them bad luck. You just keep quiet. What you might say if it's someone who you're very close to is, go then, and they say, hey, I'm off. But that's all. So mobility is crucial, and a freedom of movement. And then, of course, equality is achieved through procedures that impose sharing and prevent anyone from accumulating more than they immediately need. And if I have a big stock of things that you need, like smoked salmon, as they do in the northwest coast of America among hunter-gatherers there, well, if I can't get access to smoked salmon during the winter, I'll be dead. So that accumulation gives whoever has it great power over others. And indeed, those hunter-gatherers have very complex stratified systems with nobles, or kings indeed, nobles, aristocrats, commoners, and slaves. So the point that James Woodburn really focused on to understand egalitarianism was the systematic disengagement from property, and therefore from the potential of property to be used to create dependency. Anyone in these societies who tries to assert some sort of special status or whatever is mocked, is ridiculed. There's so much rough and rude teasing going on every day. I mean, really rude. And it's not just between peers, but small children when they insult a grown man who's pretending. There was a lovely example of it. I was in a camp that I know well, and a very dear friend of mine, he's an old man, but he's unfortunately become an alcoholic. And so whenever he finds an opportunity for getting booze, he will follow it. And because I was there, a farmer from a nearby camp decided he wanted to come and see. And so as he arrived, he didn't know anything about the place. He'd never been there before. And Fata, my dear friend, who you'll hear from later, he grabbed him under the arm and started immediately frog marching him towards the cellar of alcohol at the bottom of the village. Or the camp, actually, as it was, and saying, look, I'm the big chief here, I'm the boss of all these people, look at me, I'm the chief, you've got to get me some alcohol, which is the tradition in this part of the world, that, you know, if you arrive in a farmer's village, the first thing you do is you go and see the chief, you announce yourself, and you make an offering of some alcohol to show your goodwill. And as the as the newcomer was being frog marched along by Fata, he passed 3 little boys who must have, the eldest was perhaps 7 years old, playing in the sand, just fooling about. And as he walked past, they said in Lingala, because they knew this is the language that the visitor would recognize, not Mbenje, they said, God, well, it's a word which is really rude, so if you get offended, I apologize, but this is a direct translation. He's a cunt, he's nobody at all, he's nothing here, ignore him. And the farmer, who was absolutely shocked. You could see his jaw literally drop, but the kids just carried on playing, and Fata, in his wisdom, just continued frog marching him along without even responding, as if it hadn't happened. And you could see in the farmer's face this sort of shifting unbelief. And did I really hear what I just heard? But so anyway, so this sort of really rough teasing is really very, very common, and all the time. It's a constant banter. So of course, politically egalitarian societies mean there are no leadership roles. There aren't even any status positions. Someone may be recognized as having special knowledge about something, but beyond that moment, say elephant hunting or childbirth, that person will have no, people will not turn to them for advice or for anything else. It's just in that moment of, we're hunting this elephant now, right, how are we going to do it? And then the most experienced elephant hunter will take charge, say, right, you go this way, you go that way, it's heading towards this particular place, or whatever it is. Or a woman's in giving birth and she needs some assistance because there's a complication, then people will turn to wise elders to give them advice. But it's only in that context that their special knowledge is recognized, and beyond that it's rejected if they try and impose it. And there's no authority between people to tell others what to do. You can of course ask people politely to do things, but you can't impose yourself. So war is impossible in these societies, contrary to the views of certain evolutionary psychologists. Even parents can't boss their children, as the case of Fatah and those small children illustrated. It's considered rude to ask questions. I was devastated after asking a few too many questions, to be told to shut up and not ask any more questions when I was doing my fieldwork. I thought, God, this is a disaster. Anyway, these practices all come together to create what we call an egalitarian society, an immediate return egalitarian society. But of course, in the modern context where you've got very rapid encroachment by all sorts of hierarchically organized societies, this presents serious problems for representation. So sometimes, these outsiders come, say, a logging company, they demand to see the leader, and they take the leader off to some town to make all sorts of agreements and whatever, take decisions on behalf of the rest of the community for them. But the problem is that such persons have no legitimacy within the group. So whatever they've agreed with the powerful outsider is meaningless. They won't even tell people in the group that they've done so, because to do so would be an outrage that would provoke all sorts of problems for them. So, and if they're suspected of having benefited in some way through material gifts or whatever, and not shared them out with everybody present, then they'll get into so much trouble. It's just an unsustainable position for anybody who ends up finding themselves in such a position. So those are the sorts of language we use to discuss egalitarianism, but of course Mbengele use very different metaphors and discourse. So for instance, they're farming hierarchical status-seeking neighbors, which Woodburn would describe as delayed return people. They call them gorillas, and the reason they call them gorillas is just like gorillas, these farmers are obsessed about property. They're obsessed to the extent that they can become really violent. You walk past you tread on a twig as you're walking through the forest, and suddenly the silverback comes out retching and roaring. It's just the same when you cross a farmer's farm, and he sees you and, you thief, you're stealing my manioc again, and he comes with a big stick to try and bash you up. And these kinds of behaviors, this obsession with hierarchy, with status, with standing within the community, is something that leads the Mbengele to describe the farmers as gorillas, and they interchange the names quite often. They say that whenever farmers die, they end up being reborn as gorillas. And so Mbengele divide people up in similar ways to James Woodburn. They don't use the terms immediate return, delayed return. They have their own labels. And people who think that things belong to them, in other words, who have concepts of property, are these below gorilla types. And they're opposed to or different to people like the Mbengele, who say that the creators made the whole world for all creatures to share, and according to their need. And there's no special claim that any creature can have. And so my friend Emeka, one night when we'd gone off hunting, Emeka, myself and another chap called Kibino, and we had been hunting all day, and we lay down in the evening to make a little fire and just sleep under the stars. And as our fire smoke started to drift through the forest, a silverback, who was actually much nearer than we'd realized, started roaring and retching at us and sort of saying, you know, piss off, get out of my forest. And Emeka was furious and started swearing, using the worst swear words that I've ever heard Mbengele use, just, you know, shouting at this silverback to be quiet and leave us alone, and that we had absolutely every right to be in that bit of forest, and he should just, you know, forget it and go away if he's bothered by it. And what Emeka's reaction seemed to me at the time rather strong, but you know, with hindsight, it's clear, you know, that this kind of society is not a passive agreement of people to be nice to one another. It's an assertive egalitarianism. It's something which takes work. You have to assert your equality with others, like those small children did to Fata, or Emeka did to the silverback. That is the work of egalitarianism, is asserting your equality. Egalitarianism is imposed by those around you. You're obliged to share it fast. You just can't refuse. People will keep badgering you. And so that leads to another way that Bayaka distinguish between hierarchical and egalitarian people, is they say that hierarchical people have hard hands, whereas egalitarian people have easy hands. And that really refers to the importance of sharing. And their version of sharing, of course, I think is becoming clear, is not like our version of sharing. So in our version, I have the bag of sweets and I say, oh, I'll share with you and I'll share with you, or I won't share with you. And suddenly my bag of sweets becomes another tool of power. Whereas in their context, the bag of sweets is not mine to control. It's immediately everyone around who's within reach of my bag of sweets. Give me a sweet, give me a sweet, give me a sweet, give me a sweet, and I can't refuse. And so I just open the bag and people just shoving their hands in, taking out bags of sweets. And as soon as they, handfuls of sweets, as soon as they got their handful of sweets, someone else is saying to them, give me a sweet, and they can't refuse either. So they're shoving them in their mouth as quick as possible. But in the meantime, of course, many people will be getting sweets and demanding. So very quickly, that bag of sweets is distributed among the community without me having any control of how that's done. So I don't have the opportunities to use it to assert or to get favors off people or to assert my authority in one way or another. So when a hunter comes back with the kill and carries it back to the camp, and they have to do this because otherwise their ekila will be ruined. It's divided up, it's butchered by somebody else and handed out, divided up between the huts in the camp by somebody else again. So there's a distribution of the roles that disengage the hunter from any opportunity to manipulate that sharing. And great care is taken when sharing out things like meat to include everybody, because if someone is missing, it ruins the hunter's ekila, because they won't have had a share. They'll feel jealous, they'll feel upset. And even those people who never contribute, most obviously children, but also invalids, old people, will always get a share. And men and women have slightly different sharing styles. When in the forest, for instance, women will, say, collect wild yams. And the first thing they do as they start finding some wild yams is they build a fire and they roast as many as they can eat. And whoever's there will join them and eat as many of the wild yams as they can. And if it happens to be such an abundant wild yam patch that they've got enough to bring back to camp, well, they'll bring some back to camp. And it's the same with the men. You know, we'll go and get honey, and there's just enough honey for us to gorge ourselves and nothing to take home. And when we get back to camp, oh, well, there was no honey, and it's just accepted. But if there was enough, we bring it back and it's shared out meticulously between households. When food is prepared, the plates start moving around houses in rapid succession. And so, you know, my wife will prepare some food and she'll share it with my neighbors and her girlfriends. And she'll also send a large plate or leaf of the food to us men in the middle of camp. And older men like me who have a wife will know that she's kept something for me back in the hut. So I'll just pick, you know, just politely and daintily from the dish. Whereas the young men who haven't yet got wives will be shoveling it in, trying to get as much as they can to make sure they've got some dinner. So Sharing happens at many levels. It happens at the point of extraction, it happens at the point of return, and it happens at the point of consumption. And of course, within all that, people will try and cheat by hiding things so they don't have to share. And sometimes people will boast. But in all these cases, the rest of the community come down on them mercilessly, teasing, cursing, abandoning them, just leave. They just get up and go. They're, 4 o'clock in the morning, suddenly that whole half of the camp's gone and you're just all by yourself. Something that has happened to a number of anthropologists and others who've gone to work with these people and perhaps not been very thoughtful in their comportment. And in extreme, of course, cheating and hiding things can lead to violence. People get very upset about not being shared with properly. But the key people to criticize are widows, and they have a very special role as the critics and controllers of people who go too far. And it's something called mwajo. It's a sort of pantomime performance where they mimic the person who's done something really unacceptable. But they do it with great attention to the particular characteristics of that person and with great humor. And as they start doing this, everyone in the camp knows, oh, right, they're starting a performance. This is going to be funny. And so quickly all the kids start encircling them, and everyone else who can get away from whatever they're doing comes and starts watching. And as they carry on with the performance, the audience will start commenting, oh, well, look, that's not right. Oh, that's not right. And so in a sense, there's a sort of whole normative discussion that starts developing around the performance, the reenactment of these old ladies. And what's interesting is that the old ladies will only stop when they see the person that they're mimicking laugh at themselves, at the sketch that they're performing. Very clever. Anyway, this type of behavior is based on the extraordinary solidarity that women have. And this solidarity is also something that comes through ekila. It gives them the political power and independence, the fact that women will really be together day in, day out, to resist the brawn of men, the strength of men. So if men try and beat a wife or something, her sisters and friends will quickly come to her help, to her assistance. And so things quickly escalate, and that leads to people desisting from activities or behaviors which will cause such escalations. And the other part of the autonomy and the power that gives women such strength in these societies is that they are economically independent from men. So women don't need to depend on men for food. They can fish, they can collect wild yams, insects, fruit, and other things quite happily. But also men don't require women's food in order to survive. They can hunt, they can collect honey, they can dig wild yams, and also live very well. And what's interesting is that this economic independence is enshrined in the creation myth. And I won't have time this evening to tell you that, but centrally what happens is that when Kumba, the creator, made the forest, he made women and men separate. He put them in different parts of the forest and didn't tell the other about the existence of the other group. And it was only much later. And these groups, of course, they had the same economic practices that men and women have today. So the women just, fished and collected wild yams and so on, whereas the men just hunted elephants and other animals and collected honey and dug wild yams too. And so in the men's version of the creation myth, it was the elder man, Tuli, who went and discovered the women's camp and then told the men how to find it. And what the rather nice part is that what they did is they bufiengad the women. They did an encirclement ambush technique that's used for hunting pigs. But in this case, rather than use spears and so on, they took leaf parcels of honey. And when the women scattered as the elder man went into the middle of them, each of the men beat the woman with a leaf parcel of honey, and it burst as it hit her forehead or her body. And as it started to move into her mouth, and she tasted it. It's so sweet. Maybe these strange people aren't so bad. Maybe I'll slow down a bit, not run away so fast. And of course, that gave the men a chance to catch up, and they very quickly discovered the joys of sex and so came together. But in that coming together, the women gave up a forest spirit called a jengi, which they would dance to create children, to create little girls who would fall from his leaves. And men, when they saw this, they said, look, we've got to have that. You can't have that anymore. We're going to throw away these horrible things they were copulating with, a sort of hard forest fruit, and we'll take a jengi. And then that way we'll stay together and we'll make children together. And in fact, that was the foundation of society. And there are all sorts of ways that this cosmology is relived and re-experienced in ritual. In the women's version of the myth, of course, it's them, the women, who go and discover the men, or the elder woman who goes and discovers the men. And the women say they gave a jengi because they have so many other very powerful spirits that they still control. So it was no problem to give a jengi to the men. But men emphasized they took a jengi by force. Women had no choice. And they changed the energy, the magic of a jengi, so that rather than cause women create babies, young girls, a jengi, if ever a woman touched him, would cause them to menstruate without stop, to bleed to death effectively. And so this creates a very spectacular energy when a jengi comes into the community, as he does at regular intervals in ritual. But the point of me telling you that is that the different interpretations of the myth are characteristic of the way that men and women's group vie for respect and undermine each other's claims to be more important or more significant. In effect, each gender group stresses the significance of their own action in the establishment of contemporary society and contests other groups' claims. So the gender groups have agreed to disagree and maintain a balance of power that shifts with the moment, but remains roughly equal over time. And this speaks to the what Mona has described as communism in motion, when she discusses Ngoku and Ijengi, these different spirit camps. Key in that myth is honey, and women love honey, as we all do. But because they love it so much, men take great risks getting it. And hunting, like honey collection, is very dangerous. Oh, sorry, I should have said that the other way around. Honey collecting, like hunting, is very dangerous. And men do fall out of trees and get very hurt and crippled, like a dear friend of mine, Mongimba. But in all sort of romantic encounters between young men and young women, the gift of honey is the way that one expresses one's interest in a girl. And if the girl accepts your honey, then she's also accepted your intimacy. And it's because of practices like that, this sort of way that the myth and the role of honey in getting men and women together, and its continual role in getting men and women together today, that cosmology becomes alive, it becomes relevant, it actually contributes to making your life more meaningful. It's not an abstract sort of body of philosophical ponderings. It's something that's directly relevant to your everyday, to your life, to your lived experience. And ekila is just like that. It anchors key areas of cosmological knowledge, gender and political ideology, and the physical and biological experiences of human growth and maturation, so that the gendered practices and cultural values take on a natural, a sort of inevitable quality. And I'm going to quote a friend of mine, Emeka, actually, as he explains further. Ekila is the same as Mobeku. That's the name of the medicine god Komba, sent women when women put in the moon, i.e. when they menstruate. The business of ekila was first with them. It's all about children. You can see women's tummies swell up at that time. It's the wind. They have to expel their wind as ekila, i.e. blood. This cleans out their wombs. If that blood stays in the body, it will make the woman ill. She has to get rid of it. If she doesn't do ekila, then she has to do ekila. This is how it should be. Women's biggest husband is the moon. If I'm a hunter, I don't sleep around with different women. If I slept with her, then her, then her, and then her, all the animals would know. They'd smell my smell and know, that hunter has ruined his own ekila. He's ruined his hunting. Some will even come with great anger. Others, you'll shoot at them, but they won't die, and you're very surprised. When you shoot at an antelope from close range and it doesn't die, we call this ekila. So I ask him, does a good hunter have strong ekila? If someone's hunting is good, they won't say his ekila is strong. They'll just say he hasn't ruined his ekila. Even a great hunter who sleeps around with women all over the place will ruin his hunting. We call a man who's ruined his hunting with women matena. And so I ask, well, why do you call all this ekila? And he answers, we Bayaka call all this ekila because our fathers called it that. This whole business comes from our forebears. Women's blood is one thing, men killing animals is another. Komba made it like this. Women put in the moon, it's mobeku. Men's mobeku, which is another word for ekila, is just nose bleeding. Men's ekila is about hunting. The hunter's meat is ekila. If someone else eats your hunter's meat, then your ekila is ruined. Your hunting is ruined. And I hope you got a sense of how confusing the word ekila is and all that. But the gendered ekila prescriptions result in Benjelin men and women cultivating distinctively different comportments. And these are exemplified in the way they walk in the forest, whereas men who want to creep up on animals walk quietly in small groups or alone while they hunt. Women walk in large groups, rarely alone, and they yodel loudly to ensure that they don't surprise any animals. Premenopausal women fear large animals because they smell of ekila from their vaginas. And this might seem strange that they fear the animals in the forest that surrounds them. But in my research area, there are about 15,000 hunter-gatherers in 1.3 million hectares of forest, about 0.2 persons per square kilometre. And that's typical of hunter-gatherer populations. The local conservation organisation estimated that in that same area, there are around 23,000 elephants. There are around 23,000 gorillas, about 9,000 elephants, and about 4,500 chimpanzees. And chimpanzees are really quite dangerous. So there is really good reason for these women to be fearful. It's not just, some sort of figment of their imaginations. And so long as a man hasn't recently had sex or been sleeping near a menstruating or pregnant woman, he won't smell of human ekila, and so he'll be able to pass without offending the animals. One result of this is that women orientate themselves inwards towards other group members, whereas men represent the group to outsiders, as warriors fearlessly hunting the large, dangerous mammals of the forest or obtaining goods from the potentially dangerous farmer neighbors. So basic beliefs about ekila and the piecemeal explanations given for them differentiate people according to gender and to a lesser extent according to age. And so I just want to briefly summarize the ontogeny of ekila, the cultural ontogeny of ekila. As a child, you see your mother not eating the meat she's just prepared for you, and you're eating it, and you start wondering why. Food is really matters to small children. As an adolescent, you start hunting if you're a boy, and while you're out with the men, you hear them talking about ekila, discussing why someone missed, or why someone got attacked by a dangerous animal, or why someone's not finding any animals. They're all running away from him. And of course, people apply common sense. They don't just dogmatically follow ekila. They're sensible people, like people are everywhere. But when a girl starts menstruating, she'll be taken by her mother and shown how to dispose of the blood, not in water or by washing, but by carefully wiping and placing the leaf, special sorts of leaves and bark that she'll use to do that, in the undergrowth, in deep undergrowth. And the reason she'll be told is that the edio, who are a very unpleasant type of spirit, will be able to feed on that blood because they love that blood more than any other blood. It's more potent, it's more powerful than other blood. And so by putting it there, they'll still be able to get it, and they won't cause problems to people in camp. These kinds of explanations, or for instance, if she starts menstruating, they can't move camp, things that really do strike you as why, and demand some sort of reflection. And so it's a sort of alerting quality of these prohibitions and taboos that makes people curious about ekila. And then with marriage and the reproductive interest in having children, ekila looms large. And there are an increasing number of restrictions that become applicable to a newly married couple. And many of them are forbidding them eating especially desirable or common foods like the blue duiker. It's a small antelope that's very easy to catch and is very often caught, but suddenly they can't eat them. One day, as I sat in Fata's hut in deep forest, he explained further to me. He pointed to his sleeping mat and he said, "This is where I sleep all alone, just me, without any women, by myself on this mat. I don't sleep with my wife anymore because of ekila. My ekila is big, very big. I kill elephants. Boom. Old men, Kombeti like me, don't screw women anymore because of ekila. That's how the fathers advised us to look after our ekila." Ekila is something only for one person. If you mix your ekila around with lots of people, then if you're a man, your hunting is ruined. A woman has problems in childbirth and her infants get weak and ill. Children who can walk can do as they like. They have their own ekila. After your wife has given birth, it's ekila to have sex with her until the child can walk. Otherwise, you can kill that child. And I ask him, do women have ekila? Women have ekila too. A woman's ekila is with the moon. When a woman is ekila, menstruating, her husband takes her smell. So he doesn't go hunting or walking in the forest with friends. Animals flee when they smell a woman's mubeku, this ekila. The animals smell her on him. If strong animals like gorilla, elephants, buffalo, or leopards smell it, they will come, even from far away, charging towards him in a rage, passing other people just to get to him. So implicit to Fata's explanation is the opposition between animals and humans' reproduction. Unlike the narrative of animals giving themselves to the hunter that's common in the polar regions, here people emphasize that people have to outwit animals and engage in mortal combat in order to hunt them. My friend Cabello explained further. If you are ekila, animals attack you. In big forest full of large game, having sex is ekila. It's a huge ekila. This is because we're in conflict, in bita, they call it, with the animals. If they smell the odor of women, some are frightened and flee you. Others come from far away and follow you. Only you. That's why women are frightened in the forest. The animals smell them. And it's important to remember that in the dense undergrowth of this forest, smell, like hearing, is a very powerful mediator and indicator of what is not visible. And because it's a conflict with the animals, that explains why the smell of human reproduction so angers or frightens them. In fact, in Bengele folk biology, the high point in the reproductive cycle is menstruation. It's the point of the highest fertility. If you really want to ensure that your wife gets pregnant, you make love, especially when she's menstruating. And a man whose wife is pregnant should not go hunting. Cabello expanded. Children come out of men, the liquid of men. A child is only sperm. You put your sperm into the body of a woman. You do this every day, until her moon is dead. Who saw her moon? So she asks you, her husband, where's the moon? He didn't come up this month. We men cut the moon from women. And he said that laughing. If your wife puts in the moon, you, her husband, must cut her moon. If you do this, a child will start growing in her womb. Their big secret is making children from our sperm. Our work is to give body to the child, the woman's to give birth to it. So when you understand this, suddenly you understand that pregnancy requires continuous work. And knowing that, I suddenly understood why the taboos are shared between the procreated couple. And similarly, observing hunters leaving camp with the striking red lines on their forehead aroused my curiosity, as I imagine it does other youthful Mbengele. Even more intriguing were the puzzling answers people gave to my questions. Oh, they're Mubeku, they're ekila. So they find food, or to make sure they aim well. Much later in field work, when I asked a friend out of earshot of others, he explained in a whisper that there are numerous of these nasty Edur spirits that consume human and animal blood voraciously. And this is what he said. They're much attached to blood. and they become jealous and nasty when they're deprived of it. They need blood to exist. That's why a menstruating woman leaves her ekila blood in the forest. These spirits eat that blood and they like it more than other blood. They get used to it and they'll look out for her. When her man cuts her moon, those spirits miss many meals. They get furious and very jealous of men when they realize, so they try to stop us getting food. But the forefathers found ways to avoid this. That's why the esior, this is a red ball of paste that they use to mark their foreheads. Well, that's what the esior is for. You don't rub it off. You let the wind take it to the edior spirits. The blood will calm them so you can find food. And we leave the ekila meat for them to eat when we do this. So ekila prescriptions pan out to define which animals you can eat, whether you will hunt as a man or cook forest animals as a woman, whether your style of speech in the forest is loud and song-like or quiet and restrained, and whether you walk alone or in groups. So menstruation is culturally elaborated to become clearly expressed differences between the sexes and a gender ideology that defines appropriate activities and behavior. And Benjele discussed ekila in practical idioms. Breach of rules surrounding ekila cause practical problems like unsuccessful hunting or difficult childbirth. And the gendered experience of ekila and its associated prescriptions make gender roles seem logical and natural. The bodily practices, disciplines, and behavior that these prescriptions demand serve to justify the key cultural distinctions between what is proper and natural for men and women to do, between obtaining vitality from outside the group versus transforming vitality into new life within the group. So ekila defines how the body's vital forces, its reproductive potential, its productive activities and their products, moral and personal qualities and emotions should be shared so as to ensure that group members experience good health, unproblematic childbirth and child rearing, and successful hunting and gathering. From an Mbengele perspective, these are the basic components of a good life. So social equality here is about recognizing difference, celebrating it, and combining it together to be complementary. And this is, I think, a very important reminder for us that there's no a priori reason to attribute higher status to human differences. And I think this is what Nurit was trying to get at last week when she was exploring the idea of peer-to-peer as another way to try and capture what I've been calling in this talk egalitarianism. Because it doesn't mean that we are all the same, not at all. And gender equality, like social equality more broadly, is not about sameness, but recognizing that we have differences, but they are equally valued or equally valuable. Following rules that reflect the equal valuation and interconnectedness of our joint endeavor in continuing the human lineage, symbolically focus on menstruation across culture and across ages. And I think that, you know, it really is quite extraordinary that the Bayaka say that by following ekila, you will always find what you need. And indeed, ekila assures that the forest is a place of abundance because it defines what proper sharing means in relation to keeping and maintaining that abundance. And the idiom for discussing how to maintain this as a natural state, not as something special or, you know, but as an everyday experience, is ekila. How people should comport themselves and behave in order to be successful in their activities, just because nature is abundant. And if you just do things right, you will get what you need. And it's not that they or anybody else or has not followed ekila rules. Sorry, that's wrong. When you don't experience abundance, it's not because they or somebody else has not followed ekila rules, but it's because somebody's not been sharing correctly. And although that sounds very simple, it's a really profound reflection on the state of our own societies and why we are facing essentially, you know, not just climate meltdown, but something called the 6th Great Extinction, which is a really serious existential threat to humanity. So ekila is a very intelligent thing. As a collection of strikingly counterintuitive rules with dire consequences, ekila promotes a disembodied pedagogic process that stimulates curiosity and a desire to find out what's going on. It prompts, in so doing, it prompts and ensures each generation of Mbengele discover Mbengele culture. In a sense, they reconstruct it for themselves without recourse to an authority figure, making learning cultural practices more like a journey of personal revelation than instruction or subjugation to a higher authority. It makes ekila difficult to manage by authority because it's largely unexpressed as a uniform body of practices. It condenses meanings and values to establish a cultural store that ensures internal communication between the generations without attributing special status or authority to any individual or institution. In that sense, it works by hidden persuasion, ontologically anchored in inevitable and striking life processes. And I was going to end on something just about abundance as the natural state. Mbengele rituals are concerned with maintaining and celebrating abundance of the forest for people. And they do so by establishing a dialogue between people and the rest of the forest. And because they establish this dialogue, it allows them to make demands, to demand share from the forest. As you would from members of your own family, because from their point of view, people who you interact with are your extended kin. And so the Bayaka have this proverb: a Bayaka loves the forest as she loves her own body. And they believe that the Komba created the forest for them, and it's always been and will eternally be there for them. I've had friends doubting me when I've tried to explain the existence of the Sahara Desert, for instance. They have an unswerving faith that the forest will always provide them with what they need. Abundance for them is the natural state. Failure or difficulties in the food quest or procreation are discussed in relation to proper conduct and sharing as defined by ekila, rather than to inadequacies in human skill or the environment's ability to provide. In a sense, Mbengele is saying something very important to us, that by sharing properly and treating resources respectfully, they will always be experienced as abundant. Sadly, currently, we've really forgotten that. And we're busy carving things up and hoarding things. But for the Bayaka, they've experienced the forest as a place of abundance for the entirety of their cultural memory. And why can I say that? Because they have no word or concept for starvation. The idea of famine is something unbelievable to them. So central to anchoring this cosmology meaningfully and relevantly into the lives of every generation of Mbengele is the biological necessity of menstruation. If life is to continue, then menstruation, as Emeka reminded us, has to happen. And this makes menstruation a remarkable thing, a key biological process that human culture across the world anchors its key ideologies around. Okay, thanks.
Well, that was absolutely magnificent. I can see that everyone's absolutely entranced. All right, Shivali got a way of actually clapping on the screen. I wasn't not sure how you do that, visual clapping. Anyway, questions and discussion, everybody. It's a bit hard to follow.
I can see Jessica has her hand up.
Oh, really? Okay, go on then, Jessica. I can't see the hand here, but go on.
Hi, thanks to the Society and to you, Jerome. I was just interested in how you mentioned houses, and I was interested in what these people's relationship was with the ownership of houses, and in particular the material they use to build those houses. I'm researching at the moment changes around when we move from worshipping in caves to temples for an essay. So I'm sort of interested in relationship to material and ownership of it. And I just thought it was quite interesting that you sort of talked about a culture that's doesn't identify with property but has houses. So I was just interested to hear about that, and if inheritance of houses is a thing.
Okay. I guess what I should have emphasized, if Chris asked me not to use a PowerPoint, so I didn't give you any photos of camps and the places people inhabit, but essentially in these societies you can build a village, if you like, in about 2 hours. So there really is no sense of the materials that you have collected and procured for your house as having any sort of problematic access. You will always find them. It's an amazingly beautiful large leaf that's waterproof, fireproof, heatproof. It insulates you, keeps you warm, and that's just hooked onto lianas, which are bent over in a sort of geodesic dome-shaped construction. And it really does, when we move through the forest, we stop around sort of 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then by 3 o'clock, the huts have been all made and we're all ready to sit around and hang out and eat food and whatever it is. So the question of ownership isn't really a problem, and neither are the materials that you use to make it. This changes now with sedentarization being forced on people through various efforts of outsiders generally. And so what happens there is that rather than any individual owning a house, a clan will own a house. And I remember in the early days, we arrived in a village where there were some Benjele who had built houses. And my friends who I was with, they just pushed open the doors and they are, whose house is this? Whose house is this? And someone said, oh, it's so-and-so's house. They said, what clan is he? And they said, oh, he's a Bopanja. Oh, I'm a Bopanja. And so he just walked straight in, found the clothes and various things that were hanging around inside the house, took the things that he wanted and just went off again without saying a word. And that was perfectly normal, acceptable behavior. So once you enter into this system where you're not bothered by property, many of the sorts of issues that become big problems for our societies just disappear and dissolve. They don't even begin.
Can I just say, once or twice, some of you have been a bit upset that I turned the video off, and it's just because I have to do that now and again, because otherwise everything starts to freeze. So, okay, and Joe.
Chris,
yeah, go on.
No, Joe, the issue was that you weren't muted and your picture kept coming on.
My picture kept coming off.
Yes, because it depends on someone making sound if their picture comes on.
I see it.
That's what happened.
All right.
Just so you remember next time.
Quieter. Right. Sorry, yeah. I'm so sorry, everybody. Yeah. So you didn't need to keep seeing my picture. Joe.
Hi, thanks so much. Once again, I find myself with too many questions, so I'm happy I will be lecturing next week as well. So I just chose a few. So first of all, continuing on your point about abundance, it made me think that perhaps delayed return economies are related to food instability, to less abundant ecologies. And certainly when we think about places where systems of hierarchy have developed, we see these kinds of food ecologies. So maybe this is something we can talk about a little bit. I'm really curious about this approach that the Bayaka have of being in conflict with animals, because I am familiar with the anthropological literature about the animals giving themselves or they're being seduced to give themselves. So I'm really curious about this change. I was a little bit surprised by this. And finally, there's this interesting point I came across in your dissertation, which is just so mystifying that I have to ask you about it. So they have this idea of souls being reborn. And if the soul is okay, I think, then they go to Combus camp in Putu, and they call it Putu, and you say that's the same word for Europe, and you elaborate a little bit on that, but I was just, this is so strange to me, so maybe you can explain that to the students.
Okay, well, those are some great questions. opens the door. Right, well, you may have to control me, Chris, if I talk too much, because there's some really rich themes there. So I'll start at the beginning. The question of abundance. It's very interesting, this, and you're quite correct in your intuition that delayed return systems do seem to be part of the product of entering very seasonal environments. And this becomes one of the sort of bugbears I have with a lot of archaeologists and evolutionary theorists who start to interpret humanity's move out of Africa as the moment in which we became somehow cognitively modern. And this is just so ludicrous and preposterous and fundamentally racist, actually. What really happened as you start to get into seasonal environments, if you can't assure your food supply during that period of scarcity, then of course you will suffer enormously, if not die. And we all know that big brains require huge resources. And so if we don't really give serious attention to where we're getting those rich fatty foods, we go extinct. And we can see that all other lineages of Homo who have evolved very large brains have gone extinct. We're the only ones left. So, there is really strong evidence to support that. And so you get, for instance, I mentioned salmon and the salmon rivers up in the northwest coast. If you couldn't control one of those salmon rivers during the winter, you would die. And if you lost control of one of those salmon rivers to some marauding band of warriors, well, you would beg to be a slave in that community, because otherwise you would simply die. So scarcity is very closely linked, I think, to the reinstitution of hierarchy among early hunter-gatherers. Now, that doesn't mean that hierarchy never evolved in Africa, in that long period before people left. I'm sure it did many times over. But what is important and relevant is that egalitarianism, these immediate return types or peer-to-peer societies, were the predominant type. And in the San case, for instance, of Southern Africa, there is a historical account of a particular San man who was very charismatic and was able to mobilize other San to come with him to raid the caravans that were coming through their territory. And they were feared greatly, and he became very powerful in that region. But as soon as he died and his charisma was no longer holding the group together, it just broke down and dispersed. That the culture couldn't sustain that level of hierarchy and the structures. It really depended on his individual charisma. And among the Twa hunter-gatherer pygmies of Uganda, there was a similar chap called Basieti, who was just extraordinarily charismatic and able to mobilize people. So when I say immediate return systems dominated the past, especially in Africa, where we evolved, it's not to deny that hierarchy can't ever emerge. It can from time to time, but it doesn't last. It doesn't sustain itself in the way that it can around the Salmon River, for instance, and that's the big difference. Yeah, your intuition was absolutely right. Yes, animal beta, and then all these nice stories of animals giving themselves over to hunters. I don't know if you've ever tried hunting, but you have to be smart. You have to outwit that animal. You're not going to get it just by asking it nicely. It really is a very deep connection of knowing that animal, its intimate details of its life cycle, its habits, its tendencies, its character, its proclivities. It's with all that knowledge that you are able to outwit it. And then when it comes to taking on an animal, I mean, if you try killing a pig with a spear, it's no mean feat. They will be as mean and vicious with you as they can. And if they knock you over, they try and knock you with the side of their head against your legs. And if you fall, then they immediately just start gouging your stomach with those fearsome teeth of theirs. And it really is dangerous. I mean, you really don't mess around. And elephant hunting or buffalo hunting, I mean, really is extremely dangerous. And there are people I know who've been very seriously hurt and damaged in such encounters. So I think that there's an element of realism, which I rather like among the Mbengele, in relation to that really does reflect the actual business of hunting if you ever try it. And it's something which is lost on lots of Westerners, especially those who use guns to hunt. You know, it's a very surgical way of killing, and very unlike the sorts of experience you'll have if you try and do these things with spears or bows and arrows. The reborn, yes, and the business of putu. In order not to go on too long, essentially, when I talk to one old lady who's an extraordinarily wise person who really explains much of Mbengele culture to me, Doka is her name. It means small fishing trip. And Doka, she explained, look, sometimes when I'm asleep and I'm dreaming, my ancestors come to me and we talk, and they tell me things that are important, like how I could heal that child or support this particular effort we're making to move to some other place. And when I see them, they don't look like they looked like when they died. They look like they looked when they were young, and they have a sort of pale complexion that looks like you people, like you people who come from Europe. And so that's why we think that when people die and we bury them in the ground, they come back up in Europe, because that's what they look like when we see them again. And this has led to some very complex moments for me where old ladies will come and say, they'll sit me down and they'll say, look, he's got a scar on his elbow just here. When he walks, he limps. And I'll say, and I know what's coming. And I'll say, oh, okay, yeah. And they say, look, when you see him in Putu, when you're back there, make sure you tell him, I need a machete. I need a new pot. I haven't had a pot since he died and left me. Make sure he sends me a pot. And you can bring it with you when you come back. And so I end up having to, buy lots of machetes and pots and other things and give them out to old ladies when I go back. But so it's really this business of the direct experience of your ancestors or your dead relatives in dreams that leads to people calling or assuming or logically putting two and two together and saying that, well, they must be in Putu, this place where a sense of ignorance and stupidity of white people, that they have these things like aeroplanes or engines and guns and things that are really dangerously powerful, but yet they're just so dim. They really don't get the basics of proper moral behavior, and that kind of thing leads them to sort of suspect we come from a weird netherland. We're not quite human. We're not really proper people, and sort of somewhat distrust us, quite understandably, actually. Anyway, there's a lot more to be said in that, but anyway, very good questions. Thanks, Dan.
Can I make a quick sort of follow up? I'm wondering whether that sort of categorical distinction, between those hunter-gatherers where the animals kind of make an offering of themselves if you're nice to them, and those where you have to be just brutally outwit the animal, whether that distinction is a bit of an artifice, simply because I just don't believe that hunter-gatherers anywhere can be that different. And there must be a distinction between the spirits of the animals and the actual brute fact of the animal with its body and its teeth and its hooves. So, I mean, you said yourself, Jerome, that if you're nice to the forest, it will provide its abundance, and presumably that abundance includes the game animals which men are able to kill. So there is a sense among the Bayaka that the game animals are provided if you observe the rules of ekila, but it's just that there has to be a distinction, I would have thought, everywhere between the sort of physical intelligence any hunter has to use in dealing with an animal, and then the spiritual levels of cooperation between humans and the animal world. So I'm just doubting whether that distinction is that real. I imagine it's a bit of some not very good ethnography going on in some of those places where people think that hunters literally believe the animals come along and say, okay, you can have me because you've been behaving nicely. I don't really believe that.
Well, yeah, I personally, I am skeptical too, from having hunted and spent time hunting, not just in the Congo. Um, but there is a very interesting phenomena in the Arctic, and this is something that reindeers do apparently, is that when you're stalking reindeer, now of course you have to bear in mind that these are very open landscapes, so your chances of really coming up by surprise on a reindeer are quite slim, and at some point in your stalk you're very likely to be seen by the reindeer. And apparently what reindeer do at that point is they turn their head to wherever you are. Generally it's better to approach an animal side on than head on if you want to hunt it. They turn their head to wherever you are and they give you a long hard stare. And this has been interpreted, or at least in the reports of ethnographers, as being the moment where the animal gives itself over to you. It's saying, look, here you are. So, you know, there may well be a basis in the particular game animals that Arctic hunters are habitually hunting for those kinds of elaborations to occur. But you're right, you know, at a fundamental level, it's about some sort of moral behavior on the part of the hunter, which assures their success. But even though that moral behavior in the Bengele case leads to the forest being abundant, it doesn't cease to mean that you need to apply your cunning and good sense to your hunting activities. Otherwise you will get hurt. It is a mortal combat. And you don't take on a mortal combat if you're not prepared to fight to the death, is essentially what they're saying. And they're right. You better be sure to be fierce if you're going to go into one of those things.
Can I chip in a little at that point? Just asking about the category of trickster in relation to the Bengele Bayaka, because often trickster will be expressing, as master of game, is expressing this uncertainty of whether the game is going to be caught or not, and the need to observe the rules. If any kind of offence is caused, the trickster will then spirit away the animal. So do the Bengele have some equivalent?
Well, that's a very good question, Camilla. I mean, it's something which I'm, you know, I haven't yet figured out properly. When I talk to Bengele, they don't have any of those ideas, but ethnographers, they say that they have these, there are these sort of spirits, companions of animals, and you need to somehow charm and you know, make those spirit companions feel good in order to get the animals. But my Bengele friends never talk about hunting in that way. Even elephant hunting is not done in that way, or at least as far as I've learned about it. And I haven't participated in elephant hunting for obvious reasons. But it really is something that you know, just doesn't come up. And unless I actually, one time I gave a seminar at LSE, I remember, and Peter Gao criticized me very strongly, saying, oh, he said, well, what about perspectivism? Do the Bengele have the idea of perspectivism? And I said, well, look, you know, they don't talk about it. And so I haven't introduced the idea in my work. Yeah. He said, it's a cop-out. So I thought, well, I better ask properly. So when I went back, you know, some months later, I said explicitly, you know, I explained Viveros de Castros's claims about Amazonia. And the Bengele just looked at me like, these people are weird. We don't do that.
Should send them to do some anthropology in Amazonia.
Yes.
But there is your the song you were telling about the elephant hunt, which has connects to mantis. Yes.
Well, okay. So this. So this is where it's perhaps more analogical than perspectival. So the idea, you know, when praying mantis do this sort of with their wings and their legs, and they sort of puff themselves up and become more. And if you actually do that physically, you will find yourself feeling more strong. And I have a friend who it's about centering. I think, you know, he's a musician, and he sometimes performs in front of quite large audiences. And he says that the trick he's learnt to sort of get himself in the right frame for facing those audiences is to stand just behind the curtain before it goes up, or, you know, in the back of the stage. And he leans forward until he's almost falling over, and he just holds himself at that point of equilibrium, and he finds that really brings him into his center, so that when he goes on stage, he just is, you know, himself. And I do wonder if that, you know, if you try doing the Kabamelongo Kodi dance, it does actually, you somehow get into your center. And the points the men make why they do that dance is because, you know, just imagine you're walking through the forest and suddenly you hear this group of pigs, and all you've got is your spear with you, and you've got to, you know, take on that pig. And if you don't do it right, you know, that pig will knock you over and, you know, possibly gouge your entrails. So, you know, it really is quite frightening. And you do need that courage. And so you'll be sitting there thinking, no, all those kids hungry back at home. My wife's been telling me I need to bring some pigs. Oh, but look, they're so frightening. I don't want to do it. And so those sorts of ways of supporting yourself to take it on are really good.
Okay. But just to make the point for others, that the mantis occurs in Bushman cosmology. It's also in Hunter, and so perhaps there's a very ancient level of symbolism in that connection.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there are more mantis stories I need to dig out and find, and I'll ask about Longo Kodi next time I'm there and see what I can find out.
I'd just like to add something, because the Longo Kodi song is about a chameleon. The Longo Kodi is a chameleon, and you see Longo Kodi Kaba Menguli. That means Longo Kodi, give me strength, give me courage. Actually, it is, because what does a chameleon do? It transforms. It adapts to its environment, and that's what hunters do. When you see the children's games, how children become chimpanzees, one half of them, and the other become hunters, you are really learning about the animal. You become the animal, you fuse with the animal, and you communicate with the animal in order for a successful hunt.
Well, that's a very good point, Ingrid. I'll have to double check on that. Longo Kodi, is it chameleon or a mantis? Very good point. Dawn, yeah.
Right. So, you know, I'm thinking about today. And so, like, in these times of, you know, you have deforestation, creeping development, and of course, obviously, you know, now there's devastating effects of COVID-19. So I was just wondering, how do these groups, how are they changing the way they live, or how are all these contemporary developments changing the way they live? I mean, how are they adapting? You know, that's something I think about, you know.
Absolutely. Well, it's I mean, you know, there's a whole couple of hours we could do to you know, start to properly address some of the issues that are related to that. But essentially, look, what's happened is that their forest has been turned into floral and faunal assets that are now being traded by national elites to outsiders. So, you know, the floral assets are, of course, the trees, and those go to loggers. Currently, it's mostly Chinese and Asian companies. Previously, it was mostly European companies, and prior to that, French companies. The faunal assets are being mostly dominated by Americans at this current time, or at least an American organization, Wildlife Conservation Society. And each of those groups, you know, in good hoarder style, will not literally put fences, but will put sort of I guess, legal fences, which are then enforced by militarized men around the resource that they value. So the safari hunters or the conservationists, you know, have these eco guards who go around and they find someone hunting duiker for their family and will beat them and take the duiker, steal the duiker effectively. And this has created a terror, a real terror in communities around the forest. And so many people now come out of the forest when the loggers and the conservationists are active in the forest, and they stay near farmers' villages because they feel that the farmers are better connected with the authorities, and so will be able to protect them a little bit better. But fundamentally, the consequences of inviting, and it is what the World Bank calls stakeholder management. So, you know, they looked at these big forests and they said, oh, we need to preserve those forests. They're so important for everybody else. We need to make sure there are stakeholders who control all the different forests. And they completely ignored local people, the farmers as well as the hunter-gatherers, and then just handed it out to these foreigners. And it's a sort of neo-colonialism, which in fact, you know, independence in many African states was not truly independence. It was a new form of neo-colonialism where national political elites were effectively the collaborators with business and military interests of the former colonial powers. And of course, now China has managed to make huge inroads into those relationships. But the problem is that, you know, national elites who are intended or expected to represent their people actually aren't. They're representing their own interests. And, you know, kleptocracies are the standard in Central Africa, I'm sorry to say. And the result is that anything that is an asset that can provide benefit to those national elites is used in that way as their own personal, you know, object, which they can somehow rent or trade or give away to some outsider. I mean, anyway, I could go on, but, you know, for instance, when the president of China came to visit Sassou Nguesso in Congo, he came with a big bag of money, and he gave the money to Sassou with no strings attached, which was very convenient because all the Europeans were doing all these, you know, loans with strings attached. And said, look, just all you have to do is just make sure that any subsoil resources that you come across in the next 25 years, you give us, the Chinese, first call. And of course, you know, in thinking about the elements and minerals, which will be the determining factor as to who dominates late capitalism, it's who has access to these very rare minerals in particular. So the Chinese have been situating themselves in the past 15, 20 years now very effectively. And I personally think that they've rather successfully replaced the former colonial powers in these neo-colonial arrangements. But the neo-colonial arrangements remain in place. And you know, it is a tragedy that Congo Brazzaville, which is where the Bayaka live, is not even considered a developing country. It's considered a developed country. They earn so much money from petrol. They earn so much money from the minerals that are dug out of the soil. But if you would travel in the villages, even in the president's village, you see appalling levels of poverty. I mean, really abject poverty. And, you know, I mean, it's improved in recent years, but, you know, when I was there doing field work, schools had no benches, no school books, often no teachers. Hospitals were just empty rooms, and if you wanted to get treated, you had to go to the commercial pharmacy to buy the things you needed for your operation or whatever. So a level of negligence and disinterest in the welfare of ordinary people that is, you know, profoundly shocking, I think. So this new situation that these neo-colonial arrangements have led to is one that has steadily disenfranchised hunter-gatherers and farmers of their rights to land. I wrote an article about it. It's called "Our Life Has Been Turned Upside Down and Nobody Cares." And there's an accompanying film. I just put a camera up in a camp, and I said, look, if anybody has, it was just before one of the conferences on hunting and gathering societies, And I said, look, you know, they're interested in what you think about your current situation. So would you, you know, just if you have something to say, come and sit down in front of the camera and share it. And, you know, for a whole afternoon, people came and sat down in front of the camera and gave their views. And we put it together into a short film with Ingrid, my wife. And it's a very powerful and very profoundly accurate analysis of the situation by these people who you know, many people will not even turn to give a thought to, who just dismiss as being somehow you know, idiots and not worthy of any consultation or discussion in these very important decisions being made about their lives and livelihoods. Yeah, it's a tragedy. But anyway, I mean, there are sort of small efforts to try and redress this situation, but it's so difficult. Everything is stacked against them. The corruption of the system, the doublespeak of the leaders, the way that outside commercial interests just, you know, dominate. They're the ones making the roads, building the hospitals, and of course, people do want to benefit from some of these extraordinary achievements of technology and modernity, but at the same time, the costs to their autonomy, to their freedom, to their ability to practice their lifestyles as they see fit, to continue their traditions, is hugely curtailed.
Yeah, sadly. Thank you.
Yeah, tragically, yeah.
Has anyone got anything else? I suppose somehow
there are a couple of questions in the chat. Actually, I can just
really?
see.
Okay, go on. Yeah.
Has the video been uploaded online? So we did have it online. So when we made it, we asked people for their consent to put it online because we wanted to show it to this conference of academics. The result of the video actually at that conference was the formation of the International Society for Hunter-Gatherer Research. That was, you know, when the academics saw this, and it is, you know, their analysis is so accurate, so powerful and so moving that it really moved the people in the audience. And so we created the International Society for Hunter-Gatherer Research. We created the journal Hunter-Gatherer Research as a one means to try and promote not just a greater awareness of the really serious situations these people find themselves in, but also to promote more study and research of hunter-gatherers. It seems extraordinary to me how few anthropologists are interested in hunter-gatherers. I mean, it's to do with this sort of stupid notion of primitivism, which is just a tool of racists to justify their bad behavior. It's not anything which reflects, I mean, the way of life with the Bengele is so sophisticated that actually my wife and I, we spent 3 years there. We were only meant to spend 1.5 years. But in our second year, we just were so enjoying living in this way that we had no intention of coming back. And it was in fact a civil war that broke out that forced us to flee. But otherwise, maybe, you know, we'd still be there. Who knows? It really is a very humane way of living, a very sophisticated way of living. You don't miss not reading, you know, books in endless libraries. You know, there's so much going on in life, and the depth of things to discover as you enter into their secret societies and these, you know, extraordinary wells of deep thinking that their ancestors have left them in these different spaces. It really is very, very beautiful. And the humor and the joy with which they address every day is really a great lesson, a great teacher, actually.
There are different versions of the idea of primitivism. I don't have anything to do with any of them really, but I've always thought, and I still think, that it's just possible that humanity and our planet have a future. But I've also thought that if humanity does have a future, which is possible, it's hunter-gatherers like the Bengele who are already there in that future. And we need to be shown how to get there, clearly on the basis of a different level of organization of joy and abundance and egalitarianism, using the technology which has been provided by the last few millennia or certainly last few centuries of absolute horror. So somehow we need to put things together in the way you did today, Jerome, in a way which speaks politically. And so it's such a sort of travesty with all these different political organizations trying vaguely to find our way through this current absolutely shocking crisis, that somehow each splinter fixes on another, on one or other of the sort of elements. So we get environmentalists, we get feminists, we get, you know, animal rights people. Somehow the unity of all those projects is represented in the talk you've given today, and it's somehow, I don't know, the getting back to I mean, what's the most valuable resource that life gives us? It's time, and the thing which capitalism has robbed us of course, is absolutely time. We don't have time to enjoy ourselves. We don't have time to be with our children, doing the garden, all these things. So there's time. There's the sacredness of the body, and particularly blood. There's our relationship with animals. Somehow, your talk this evening has put together a picture of what the future might be on a if you like, that level, but also a higher level. And for me, it's the unity of these things. We mustn't forget the menstruation. We mustn't forget the moon. We mustn't forget all these different elements which make up that marvelous whole, which ends with what you call joy and these technologies of joy, which you've spoken about. And somehow,
yeah,
the political movement against this wretched system we've got now has to be full of laughter, full of joy. It has to be like almost. David Graeber said this sort of. We need fun. Fun's not perhaps quite the right word, because sometimes it's, you know, you have to do things which aren't exactly fun. But somehow those. I mean, before so-called development has completely destroyed that future, that which is present, of course, has been for you and Ingrid. Somehow that means hang on to the whole of it. Emphasizing this bit or that bit or the other bit is already losing kind of the whole point.
It's really difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, because our society has sort of, well, I mean, if we take the sort of positive elements of it, you know, in terms of our achievements of understanding the nature of you know, biological processes, say within human bodies, you know, this COVID issue right now. Oh, I didn't answer Dawn's question on COVID, actually. It seems, well, maybe I should just respond to Chris first, and then I'll go back to COVID. You know, we have compartmentalized ourselves. I mean, I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a, you know, we're always compartmentalizing, and how much that has to do with literacy, I don't know, because the volume of stuff that there is to master if you want to be one of these isms or ists is so huge that it's very difficult for any single mind to hold it in. One of the things that really I like about RAG is that it tries to hold as many of those different things in mind as possible. So you keep the politics in mind, while we also look at the deep history, while we also look at the cultural elements, at the ritual, the myth, and so on. And that's actually extremely rare, but so important, because as you quite rightly say, the only way we're really going to fundamentally get ourselves out of this mess is by really reimagining how millions of people can organize themselves together. It's been this weekend, I had a beautiful revelation watching a talk that Isaias and Mariam organized as part of the Ecodemia series by a guy called Andreas Val, I think. And it was wonderful because it's the first time that I've heard a viable alternative to state organization for our future. And what they talk about in this is bioregional units. And they do it according to river basins. And their basic idea is that what we should be organized around is not nation states and idiot ideas of national pride and all this, you know, Trumpist bullshit. But what we should really be focused on is the pride we have in our particular ecosystem that we depend on. You know, so if you live in the Thames Valley, then you should really be concerned about making the Thames Valley an extraordinarily beautiful place, a flourishing environment where every member of that community of species that make that bioregion are cherished, are a gift to flourish and dwell with happiness and joy. And that was so exciting to me. You know, it really, I mean, in conjunction with Camilla and your, Chris, idea of lunakism, I think offers a really beautiful path for humanity to slow down, to discover an alternative space in which we can flourish together as opposed to compete against one another and make ourselves you know, more and more you know, spectacular in my, oh, I'm such a success, and all that bullshit. Yeah, and yeah, bioregional is not new. It's obviously something that has been going on for some time in different parts, and you know, thank goodness these people have been exploring it, because I think it really does offer a very beautiful pathway to a really alternative system to this you know, messed up nation state based on these mafias of the past, these aristocrats and various bully boys who managed to dominate. Anyway, yeah. So, COVID. Should I pangolins? Possibly the pangolins that were in that wet market in Wuhan come from the forest behind me on the screen there. They are these extraordinary creatures with scales that have warm blood and so on. But there are Ebola came from not far, emerges in this forest from time to time. HIV/AIDS originated in a particular group of monkeys that are a few hundred kilometers to the what would it be, northwest of the photograph behind me, and there is a great range of zoonosis going on in these forests. And my Benjeli friends, I remember one time we were walking in a very remote part of the forest, and there was a pig lying on the ground just next to the path. And I thought, gosh, look at that, you know, meat. And I said to my friends, is that good to eat? And they said, no, don't touch it. And I looked at it and I really studied it to try and work out how they could be so unanimous and clear that no, you don't eat that, and you know, I couldn't work it out. My sort of, you know, visual acuity wasn't sufficiently good to, or understanding of pigs, to recognize what it was that was wrong with the pig that made them so clear about it. But I do often wonder if that pig hadn't got, you know, rejection of it was part of that. But but the key thing is that COVID, of course, you know, we're not quite sure of its origins yet, but one of the theories is that it was pangolins jumping to bats and then bats being eaten by people, and that in those three jumps, the illness became what it is that's such a problem to us all today. But it does seem, and now there's been very little evidence of COVID infections in the forest. There's a local logging town, and Ingrid, my wife, runs mobile pharmacies which are distributed around the forest, and so she's in contact regularly with the doctors in the hospital, and there've been very, very few cases of COVID, and that's common actually across Africa. It does seem that perhaps partly because the population of Africa is so young. 50% is, and this is a gross general of the whole of a huge continent of great diversity, but 50% of Africa's population is under 15, and because of the very harsh conditions that many people live in, I think they are actually very resistant, tough lot of people, and so perhaps their immunities are effective. Whereas in the Amazon, at least from what seems to be coming out, the indigenous people there are suffering hugely from COVID. And and partly, I think, because many of these illnesses seem to originate from Central Africa, Central Africans seem to be quite good at resisting them. Whereas in the Amazon, people just seem to be much more vulnerable and less able to resist. But anyway, it's one of those things which, of course, is evolving, and one of the troubles with these illnesses is that they continue to mutate. Who knows where it's going next? But anyway, just as a little update on that for you.
Just to say, for those of you who want to do something political about all these issues, there may be an opportunity for a good discussion in 2 weeks' time, because revolution in the time of COVID is the talk by Mark Cosman. So here Tuesday.
Just wanted to add on African hunter-gatherers that the Hadza have also not had any serious issues with COVID. So it may be just because being kind of not a very dense population, but they aren't being affected badly so far, touch wood. So they are in Tanzania, also hunter-gatherers.
Okay. Yeah, it seems the San have been quite affected because tuberculosis is so endemic.
So shall we wind up quite soon? Any guidance on that? We've been going quite a while. Fantastic discussion. I think everyone's. I mean, it will all get uploaded onto Radical Anthropology at Vimeo, and from there, if I can get my son to edit things, we also go on to Radical Anthropology on YouTube, which has recently been set up. But shall we? What do you think, Jerome, or anyone else? Do we need a bit more time, or shall we wind up now?
If there are no more questions, let's wind up, and I can go and have supper.
Okay, thank you so much, Jerome. That really was one of the greatest talks we've had for a very long time. Very, very powerful, very moving, and you put it all together absolutely wonderfully. So thanks so much. Okay, everybody, and don't forget Jerome again next Tuesday. Yeah. Sort of on religion, isn't it? It's kind of on religion, disarming religion. Which is
We'll see exactly where it goes, but anyway, that's the idea.
Okay, everybody. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Everyone.